Hello, welcome. In this lecture, we're going to study a very important concept, that is Boole's interpretation, or Boole interpreting the square of opposition. Now, what is the square of opposition? This is the traditional square of opposition that we have already discussed in the previous lectures. For those of you who haven't watched this lecture, I would request you to please watch that lecture in which we basically discuss the four relations between what? A between A, E, I, and O. And those four relations were what? It was the relation of contraries, it was the relation of subcontraries, it was the relation of contradictories, and the relation of what? Subalternation. So these are the four relations that we have extensively discussed pertaining to the four categorical propositions, that is A proposition, E proposition, I, and O. Now Boole is very important. Why? Because Boole is bringing in here a new interpretation to the traditional square of opposition. So in this lecture, we'll understand what all things does Boole have to say about the traditional square of opposition, and also what does he propose instead, right? So this is the outlay. Let's get started. First, we have to understand a little bit about the person that we're talking about. So this is who? This is George Boole. Now George Boole was basically in 19th century in 19th century logical and mathematical philosopher. He was a logical and mathematical philosopher. So you can simply understand that, traditional square of opposition, or logic for that matter, is something which is very well within the areas of his interest, right? Now, what is the aim and what is the purpose of George Boole? What is the reason why we're actually reading about George Boole? So it's very interesting. You see, under his aim or under his purpose, you simply have to understand that he challenged. What? He challenged. And what did he challenge? He basically challenged the workings of and the interpretation of what? The traditional square of opposition. TSO is the short form for traditional square of opposition. Please don't get confused. So basically, when he challenges the traditional square of opposition, he also challenges the four categorical propositions. The four categorical propositions as they have been advocated by who? By none other than Aristotle. So is this clear? We're reading George Boole for the simple reason that he challenged in his works that the workings and the interpretation of the traditional square of opposition, which is advocated by, and also the four categorical propositions advocated by Aristotle, is not correct. There is something wrong with that. And what exactly is that? We'll look into it. Okay. So Boole is important for a simple reason. For what? For his interpretation. For his interpretation of what? Of the traditional square of opposition. Now, his interpretation of the traditional square of opposition is understood as what? It is regarded as modern in nature. It is regarded as modern in nature in comparison to who? In comparison to Aristotle's. So we can infer, basically, we can infer the truth of the classical or the traditional square of opposition. The classical or the traditional square of opposition is what we have already discussed in the lecture that I was referring to in the very beginning under Aristotle. Now, what he interprets is the modern understanding of the traditional square of opposition, right? What exactly is this difference? I'll let you know in a bit, but for the time being, just understand that his interpretation is the modern. So if in the exam the question is on the modern one, you automatically understand that who are we talking about? We're talking about George Boole. And if it's about the classical or the traditional one, then we're talking about the one where we discuss the four relations between the four categorical propositions, that is given by who? Aristotle, classical or traditional. Now, what was the traditional square of opposition like? If you remember the previous lecture, I told you A, E, I, and O. I've been repeating this time and again that you always have to focus on forming this Z, right? So A, E, I, O. A and E basically have the relationship of what? Contraries. Okay. I and O have the relation of what? Subalternation, right? E and O. I and O have the relation of what? Subcontraries. Okay. and A and I have the relation of what? Subalternation. A, O have the relation of what? Contradictories, and I and E have the same relation, that is contradictories. Okay. Now this basically works both sides. This goes down, even this goes down, and this also works both sides. And A and O is also something which works both sides. So this, in short, what I've drawn here is what? This is the classical or the traditional square of opposition. Now, this is something you already know, but because why? We have already covered this, right? Now, keeping this in mind, you have understood today something, that this is the classical or this is the traditional square of opposition. This is advocated by who? By this is advocated by Aristotle. Right? Now, it's very important that you understand that when I'm saying according to Aristotle, we can infer the truth of particular propositions. Now, what are particular propositions? Please pay attention to the words that I'm using. It's very important. It has come in the exams, and it is very likely that it is going to repeat. What are the particular propositions? Particular propositions are what? They are I and O. Why are they called particular? For the simple reason of using the word some here. So, according to Aristotle, according to Aristotle, we can infer the truth of particular propositions, that is I and O, from the truth of what? From the truth of A and E. So, from the truth of the corresponding universal propositions. What are the corresponding universal propositions? This is proposition A and E. So what exactly are we referring to here? We are referring to this, 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 and this. That is, we're simply saying that according to the traditional square of opposition, which is advocated by Aristotle, we can infer the truth value of I and O from the truth value of the corresponding universal propositions, that is A and E. What is this relation that we're talking about? We're talking about subordination. If you remember, I also told you that in here, A and E are called superalterns, and I and O are called what? They're called subalterns. Is this clear? So in other words, if the question comes in the exam, this is something that you need to remember, that traditional square of opposition is talking about what? It is talking about the relation of I and O. The truth value of I and O is inferred from the truth value of their corresponding universal proposition. So relation of subalternation, right? So you have understood this bit about subalternation.